Hello everyone, I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching now? Get comfortable and relax. What I saw on Halloween in 1998 still haunts me. I still remember that Halloween night like it was yesterday, even though it was the fall of 1998. I was 13, still young enough to trick or treat, but old enough to know it would probably be my last year. You know, that awkward age where you're not a kid anymore, but not quite ready to let go of the things you love? Yeah, I was right there. My best friends Josh and Ethan and I had made plans weeks in advance. It wasn't just about the candy. Halloween in our town was a huge deal. Streets would be packed with children, and parents partied while kids ruled the night, running through lawns with half-assed costumes, causing mischief. The houses were decorated to the max, with fake spider webs stretching across porches, jack-o'-lanterns flickering orange on every step, and skeletons hanging from trees. And the air, it had that crisp bite, just cold enough to see your breath when you exhaled, but not so cold you needed more than a sweatshirt. You could smell the damp earth, fallen leaves, the chocolate, and a little something else, that scent of plastic from store-bought costumes. Man, it was perfect. The three of us had met up at Josh's house as soon as dusk started to creep in. His parents were hosting one of those Halloween parties for grown-ups, the kind where they hand out apple cider to the kids and spiked cider for themselves. We had on our last-minute costumes, nothing fancy. Ethan had thrown on a scream mask, Josh was a zombie, and I was wearing a cheap Batman cape with a black hoodie. We hit the houses on our street first, just to get things going. The wind rustled the orange and yellow leaves at our feet as we walked, and you could hear them tumble along the pavement. The sun had just about disappeared, leaving behind this deep purple hue in the sky, the last light of day slowly fading away. Porch lights flicked on, and soon we were moving through the first wave of trick-or-treaters, those little kids with their parents holding pillowcases already stuffed with candy. The sounds of giggling, the wind blowing through the trees, the occasional shriek from someone who got spooked by a fake ghoul on someone's lawn. It felt like Halloween in its purest form. After a few blocks, we made our way to Franklin Street. Now, Franklin wasn't like the other streets. It had the biggest houses, old Victorians that had been there for over a century. They always went all out for Halloween, each house trying to one-up the other with elaborate decorations and bowls filled with full-size candy bars. All of the houses on Franklin Street looked like they came straight out of a Halloween movie. All except one, the Mallow House. Everyone in town knew about the Mallow place. It was creepy all year round, not just Halloween. The house had been built sometime in the 1800s, 3 stories tall with an overgrown yard that looked like it hadn't been mowed since before I was born. The owners, Mr. and Mrs. Mallow, were an older couple who never came outside. I think I saw Mr. Mallow once or twice picking up mail, but he was always gone before I could say hello. As we got closer to Franklin, Josh nudged me. "Give you a handful of candy if you knock on the door at the Mallow place this year." I laughed it off. Psych! And then what? Get murdered? But deep down I was feeling that familiar pull, the dare, the challenge. It wasn't Halloween without doing something a little stupid, right? We made our way down Franklin Street along with all the other trick-or-treaters. There was a constant buzz of chatter and laughter as we joined the crowd moving slowly down the sidewalk. The Mallow House loomed ahead of us as we made our way closer to it, sitting completely dark. The gate at the front of the yard was open, the path leading up to the front porch covered in a layer of wet leaves. As usual, there were no decorations. No fake cobwebs, no plastic tombstones, no pumpkins. But it didn't need scary decorations. The house was scary enough on its own. I didn't even have to say it aloud. We all knew it was next. Josh and Ethan started slowing down as we got closer, and I could feel the shift in the air. The excited banter between us had faded to an awkward silence. It was that kind of house that no one really talked about, but everyone knew to just stay away. You always passed by a little quicker, maybe glanced at it out of the corner of your eye, but you never lingered. It wasn't because it was haunted. There were no ghost stories. It was just creepy. People whispered about the Mallows, mostly rumors. Mr. Mallow was some kind of veteran, though no one was sure, and Mrs. Mallow was even more of a mystery. Some said she had dementia and was shut up in one of the upstairs rooms. Others swore she was dead. Either way, no one had seen her in years. "I'm not going up there, they're freaking weirdos," Ethan said. He tried to sound casual, but I could hear the edge in his voice. Josh kicked at the sidewalk, trying to act like he wasn't bothered. I glanced up at the house, a hulking Victorian with peeling paint, sagging roof, and windows that seemed too narrow, like they were squinting down at you. Every year that house stood there, untouched by Halloween spirit, no pumpkins, no lights, nothing. Josh, of course, wasn't going to let it go. He had this thing about proving himself, especially if Ethan and I were around. That year, we'd spent most of our afternoons watching Faces of Death tapes in his basement, trying to outdo each other's tolerance for gore. He'd never admit it, but this wasn't about candy. It was about who would back down first. He nudged me, a grin plastered on his face. "I'll go if you go." My stomach nodded, but I wasn't about to back down, not in front of them. "Fine," I muttered, "but we're in and out." We knock, get the candy, and leave. Ethan looked between us, clearly not thrilled, but he wasn't about to be the only one to chicken out. "Let's just make it quick," he said. "I don't want to hang around this place." We crossed the street and made our way toward the Mallow house. The closer we got, the colder it seemed to get, as if the place had its own climate. I could feel the dampness in the air now, the earthy smell from the neglected garden mixed with the scent of old wood. Our footsteps crunched softly, and the sound seemed to disappear into the thick silence surrounding the house. When we reached the gate, we paused. The iron bars were rusty, and the gate itself hung crooked on its hinges, like it hadn't been opened in years. But tonight it was ajar, just wide enough for us to slip through. Josh, ever the brave one, was the first to step inside. The moment he crossed the threshold, the air seemed to thicken. I followed, feeling the weight of the atmosphere pressing down on me. Ethan brought up the rear, looking back over his shoulder every few seconds, as if expecting something, or someone, to jump out from behind the bushes. The porch creaked under our weight as we climbed the steps. I could see the door now, a massive oak thing with a brass knocker shaped like a lion's head. It looked ancient, the kind of thing that looked like it belonged in a museum. The windows were dark, covered with heavy curtains that looked like they hadn't been opened in decades. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched from behind them. I reached out and grabbed the knocker. I hesitated for a second, my hand hovering over the cold brass, before bringing it down with a loud thunk. The sound echoed through the house, hollow and unsettling. We waited. For a long moment, nothing happened. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves in the yard. But inside the house, there was only silence. Josh shot us a look, trying to play it cool, but I could see the tension in his jaw. "Well," he whispered, "I guess no one's home." Ethan turned to leave. "Sorry guys, nope, peace out." But before he could leave, we heard it. The faint creak of floorboards like someone shifting their weight inside. We froze. Another creak, closer this time. Then the soft click of the lock being turned. The door opened slowly, inch by inch, until it revealed a narrow gap. No light came from inside, just darkness so thick it felt like it could swallow us whole. And then, a voice, low, raspy. "Come in." I glanced at Josh, expecting him to make some stupid joke and bolt, but his face had gone pale. Ethan took a step back, muttering under his breath, "Hell no, man, no way." But before any of us could move, the door opened wider. Standing there in the doorway was Mr. Mallow. He looked even older than I expected, more skeletal. His skin was waxy, stretched tight over his bones, and his eyes, you couldn't see them. They looked hollow, empty, shadows casted around them like two black holes. He didn't smile, didn't offer any kind of greeting, just stood there, staring at us. His clothes were dirty, stained in patches I couldn't identify, and his hands were covered in something dark, like oil. My stomach turned as I tried to make sense of it all. "Trick or treat," Josh said weakly, his voice cracking. Mr. Mallow's gaze flicked down to Josh, then back to me, and finally to Ethan. His lips twitched, like he was trying to smile but had forgotten how. Slowly, he raised one hand, motioning for us to come inside. "You boys are just in time," he rasped. "We've been waiting." I felt something cold run down my spine. "We?" Ethan stepped back again, his voice barely audible. "Let's go! Now!" But before we could move, something shifted in the shadows behind Mr. Mallow. I couldn't see it at first, just the movement. Something dark. Then slowly, as my eyes adjusted, I began to make it out. It was Mrs. Mallow, or what was left of her. We stood frozen at the door, eyes locked on the sight before us. Mrs. Mallow was hunched over at the kitchen table, barely illuminated by the dim light. At first glance, she almost looked normal. Just an old woman sitting down for a quiet meal, her thin hands resting limply on the table, as though she'd been waiting for someone, waiting for us. But then I saw it, the way her body sagged, like something inside her was giving way, crumpling. Her head lolled to the side, neck bent at an impossible angle, and her body seemed to deflate, slumping lower as if gravity was pulling her apart, piece by piece. Her skin, pale and waxy under the faint light, clung loosely to her bones, too loose, sagging in folds as though her flesh was simply draped over a frame that was barely holding together. She didn't move at first, just sat there, her empty eyes staring at us. But then, there was this sound. It was low at first, a faint crinkling noise. Mrs. Mallow began to shift, slowly, horribly. Her legs seemed to twitch, her knees jerking unnaturally beneath the table, as her whole body started to fold in on itself, collapsing in slow motion. Her back arched, her spine pushing out against her thin skin, the bones grinding and popping as if they were breaking apart, rearranging themselves in ways they weren't supposed to. She was twisting, contorting, her limbs bending into unnatural angles as her body crumpled lower and lower until she finally poured out of the chair, hitting the floor with a dull thud. For a second, she didn't move, just lay there in a heap, her limbs splayed out, her chest heaving in shallow, rasping breaths. Then slowly, horrifyingly, she began to crawl. Her hands slapped against the floor, too fast, too eager, like some twisted animal skittering across the ground. Her skin, that loose, sagging skin, dragged behind her as she moved, sticking to the floor in patches like it was melting off her bones. She crawled on all fours, her body twitching with each movement, but her head stayed locked on us. Those empty, hollow eyes fixed on us, unwavering, like she could see us even though there was nothing there behind them. Nothing but blackness. Her mouth hung open, jaw unhinged, but instead of words, a wet, gurgling sound bubbled up from her throat, thick and choking, like she was trying to speak, but something inside her was broken. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. My legs were locked in place, my mind screaming at me to run, but my body just wouldn't listen. She was getting closer, too fast, her hands slapping against the floor, her joints popping and grinding with every jerking movement. And her face, God, her face. It was rotting, decaying, skin peeling away from her cheeks in thick, wet strips, revealing the gray flesh beneath. The stench hit us then, thick and rancid. The unmistakable smell of something long dead, something that had been festering in the dark for far too long. Josh let out a strangled gasp, his voice barely a whisper, and he grabbed at my sleeve. "Run," he said, his words trembling. "Now!" But I couldn't tear my eyes away from her. She was almost at the door now, her gnarled fingers reaching out toward us, clawing at the air, reaching out for us. Suddenly, her body convulsed, her back arching violently as her whole frame shuddered. Then she collapsed again, her head hitting the floor with a sickening crack. But she didn't stop. She kept coming, crawling, scraping, inching closer and closer. Josh was the first to break. He shoved past us, bolting down the steps and back toward the street. Ethan and I were right behind him, not looking back, just running as fast as we could. I could hear the door creak shut behind us, but no footsteps followed, just that horrible silence. We didn't stop until we were halfway down the block, gasping for breath, hearts pounding in our chests. I glanced back at the Mallow house, half expecting to see them standing there, watching us, or worse, chasing us. But the porch was empty, the door closed. We didn't say anything for a long time, just stood there, gulping down cold air, staring back at the Mallow house, expecting something. But nothing happened. The place was dark and silent again, like it had always been. I could still see the faint glimmer of that dim porch light, but otherwise it was just another shadow on the street. Ethan was the first to speak. His voice was hoarse, shaky. "What the hell was that? Did you see that? Was that... What was that?" Josh didn't answer. He was bent over, hands on his knees, still catching his breath. But I could see it in his face. He saw it too. He was more freaked out than I'd ever seen him. That cocky grin he always had was gone, replaced by the look of a scared child. I swallowed, my mouth dry. My brain was still trying to catch up with what I'd seen. That thing. That couldn't have been her. Not really. No one's body was supposed to look like that. The way she moved, the way she looked. The image was burned into my mind, and I felt vomit forming in my throat. Josh straightened up, finally breaking the silence. "That wasn't normal," he said, his voice flat. "There's no way that was normal." "What do we do?" Ethan asked, his eyes wide, darting between Josh and me. "We can't just leave it like this. What if someone else goes there tonight? That wasn't just some crazy old couple. That was..." Josh cut him off, his voice hard. "We're not doing anything. We're going home, and we're forgetting this ever happened." "Are you serious?" I blurted out. "We can't just pretend we didn't see that. What if something's really wrong in there? What if they need help?" Josh whipped around, glaring at me. "Did they look like they wanted help to you? That was messed up, man. I'm not going back there, and you shouldn't either. It's not our problem." I opened my mouth to argue, but the look in Josh's eyes shut me up. He wasn't being a tough guy anymore. He was scared, really scared, and maybe he was right. What could we even do? Call the cops? Tell them what? Ethan was biting his lip, his hands shaking. "Man, I just want to go home. Let's go." We started walking, fast at first, like we could outrun the memory of that house, of Mrs. Mallow's twisted body. But it stuck with me, clinging to the back of my mind like a nightmare I couldn't shake. By the time we reached Josh's place, the adrenaline had worn off, leaving us exhausted and rattled. We didn't even bother to check the rest of our candy haul. The excitement of the night had soured, curdled into something darker, something we didn't want to talk about. Josh's parents were still in the living room when we barged in, laughing with their friends, oblivious to what had just happened. For a second, the normalcy of it made me feel unhinged, like maybe we had imagined the whole thing, but I knew we hadn't. I could still see the way Mrs. Mallow's body moved, like a puppet with tangled strings. "I'm going to bed," Josh muttered, not even bothering to say goodnight. Ethan and I mumbled something in return, but no one was in the mood for conversation. We were all too busy replaying what had just happened, trying to make sense of it. Ethan and I headed upstairs to Josh's room, but neither of us bothered to change into pajamas or unpack our sleeping bags. We just laid there, staring at the ceiling. Every creak in the house, every groan of the floorboards made my heart jump. I kept picturing Mrs. Mallow's face. No, not her face. Her mask. That's what it looked like. A mask stretched too tight over something rotten underneath. I couldn't shake the feeling that she'd been watching us, not just looking at us, but really seeing us, like she'd marked us somehow. It was a stupid thought, but it stuck with me all night. I was terrified I'd wake up, and she'd be standing over me. Eventually, I must have fallen asleep, but it wasn't restful. My dreams were a mess of dark hallways, twisted bodies, and eyes. Those hollow, empty eyes staring through me. When I woke up the next morning, my skin was slick with cold sweat, my heart still pounding. We didn't talk about the Mallow house the next day. Not really. Josh was quiet, distant, which wasn't like him. He usually couldn't stop running his mouth, but now he just mumbled answers, kept his eyes down, and didn't crack a single joke. Ethan left early, muttering something about having to help his dad with some yard work, but I knew he just wanted to be out of there. I didn't blame him. The whole thing felt like we had stumbled into something humans weren't supposed to see. I left soon after, walking back to my house in the cold autumn sunlight, but the daylight didn't help. The world felt quieter, heavier. I couldn't get rid of the uneasy feeling sitting in my chest like something bad was coming for me. That night I kept thinking about what Mr. Mallow had said. We've been waiting. Waiting for what? Why had they opened the door for us? I tried to push the thoughts away, but they wouldn't leave. Every shadow seemed a little too dark, every creak of the house a little too loud. I didn't sleep well for days, and then, about a week later, I heard the news. Mr. and Mrs. Mallow were dead. It wasn't until the smell started leaking out of the house that the neighbors called someone to check on them. They found Mr. Mallow dead in his recliner. He had been dead for weeks. For Mrs. Mallow, they found her body upstairs in a chair, rotting. The coroner said she must have been dead for at least a year. Mr. Mallow had never told anyone. But I saw her. I saw both of them. We all did. That night, I swear, we saw her moving, walking, staring at us with those dead eyes. I didn't believe in ghosts, but I couldn't explain what we saw. Josh wouldn't talk about it. Neither would Ethan. We all just went back to our lives, pretending like it hadn't happened. But it stayed with us, lingering in the back of our minds, a memory we didn't want but couldn't shake. The town boarded up the house and left it to rot. No one wanted to buy it. No one even wanted to even get close enough to tear it down. But every year near Halloween, when the air turns cold and the leaves start to fall, I think about that night, about what we saw, about what really happened in that house. That sound, that wet crunch of her body as it hit the floor, it's burned into my memory. I swear I can still hear it sometimes, like an echo in the back of my mind. I had been right. That was in fact the last year I ever went trick-or-treating. A stranger paid my cabin a midnight visit. She said we're being watched. A few weeks ago, I rented a cabin near Pitkin County, Colorado for a weekend getaway with my wife and daughter. For their privacy, I'll refer to my wife as Elena and my daughter, who's between 4 and 8 years old, as Sophia. It was dusk by the time we arrived at the cabin, far later than Elena and I had planned. The afternoon's anticipation gone, the promise of a relaxing vacation already sullied, and my back sore from changing the tire which had been eviscerated by the forest road, the mood was thoroughly ruined. Maybe that should have been an indication as to how the rest of the trip would go. The cabin itself was beautiful and rustic. Nestled among the towering pines, the 2-story building blended into the surrounding woodlands with its dark-stained wooden siding and stone chimney. Large windows glistened with the last light of day, and the wraparound porch boasted a hanging patio swing, much to Sophia's delight. She ran straight for it and started swinging as Elena and I carried the bags inside. When I unlocked the door and turned on the lights, I found myself surprised by the decor. In stark contrast to the classy, almost minimalist exterior of the cabin, the interior was remarkably cluttered. It was like every square surface, countertops, bookshelves, tables, etc., was covered in little trinkets. Tchotchkes, as my mother would have called them. There were coasters, candles, vintage oil lamps, and compasses, and a bunch of wooden animal carvings, each about a foot tall. The interior wasn't dirty by any means, just more crowded than expected. I found it charming in a weird way, though Elena was less fond. I remember her taking a long look at the place and saying, "Interesting," which is her code for, "I don't like what I'm seeing, but I also don't want to make a big deal about it." It was past Sophia's bedtime, so after coaxing her off of the porch swing, I helped her get set up for the night. There were 2 bedrooms on the 2nd floor, a master suite with an attached bathroom, and a smaller bedroom that was pretty clearly set up as a kid's room for visitors to the cabin. The cabin was specifically advertised as family-friendly and good for parents with younger children, so it was no surprise when the smaller bedroom was full of colorful toys and plushies. There was a fireplace across from the bed, its mantel showcasing a full set of those wooden animal carvings. 1 moose, 1 bear, 1 trout, and so on. There was also 1 particularly large teddy bear sitting on the bed, partially buried under the covers, like it was getting ready for bed. Sophia instantly fell in love, and I thought it was sweet that the cabin's owner had gone the extra mile to make the place welcoming. I didn't love the idea of her cuddling it to sleep, though, since it likely hadn't been washed between visits, so I propped it up on a chair next to the bed before tucking Sophia in for the night. Tired from our travels, Elena and I went to sleep not too long afterwards. Saturday was our designated lake day. After making breakfast and waking up Sophia, who had to be convinced not to take her new best friend, Mr. Bear, out on the water with us, we grabbed the kayaks off of our roof rack and headed down to the shore. We were a short walk from the lake, and I was absolutely blown away by the natural splendor. Our cabin was semi-isolated, remote enough to give my family peace and privacy, but close enough to civilization that we could easily access help in case of an emergency. We were a 5-minute drive into town and a 5-minute walk to the nearest neighboring cabin, which we passed on the way to the lake. It was a gorgeous building, far more intricate and seemingly much older than the one we were renting. There was an older woman sitting on the porch as we passed it by, and although I couldn't wave since both hands were full with the kayaks, I gave her a nod and a friendly smile. She stared at me in response, her expression completely blank. She was looking directly at me, but almost looked like she was in a trance or something. "What was that all about?" I quietly asked Elena once we were out of earshot. "Not sure," my wife answered. "She looks pretty settled in there. Maybe that's her home and she doesn't appreciate her neighbor running an Airbnb." That seemed a logical explanation. I stole a quick glance over my shoulder before the house completely disappeared behind us, and saw that the woman was now walking down the steps of her front porch, her gaze still fixed on us. Elena and I exchanged worried looks and picked up the pace a little, Sophia running along ahead of us, joyful and oblivious. Once we reached the shore, we hopped into the kayaks and pushed off into the water. We weren't exactly running away from the woman. It was more so that we wanted to avoid a confrontation if we could. As we started paddling out into the lake, the woman appeared at the tree line, but never came any closer. I gave her a wave, and again, she gave me no response but a glower. It occurred to me that she might have been trying to warn us about the lake, maybe about a current or algal bloom, but I'd researched the area extensively to make sure it was safe, and her demeanor wasn't quite urgent or benevolent enough for that to be the case. The rest of the day was thankfully devoid of any more strange encounters. After a calm day of swimming and hiking, we returned to the cabin in the evening for dinner and s'mores. Sophia brought Mr. Bear outside to help with the s'mores, to mine and Elena's amusement. We had no idea how we would convince her to leave the stuffed animal behind when we left on Monday night. After we put Sophia to sleep at 8 p.m., Elena and I watched a movie, had a drink, and then went to sleep at 10:30 or so. At midnight, according to my phone clock, I heard what sounded like a knock. I sat up in bed, checked the time, and listened for a minute. A few seconds passed, and then there came 3 knocks in quick succession. I gently shook Elena awake, waiting to hear the sound again, and after a moment, I did. There was someone at the front door of the cabin in the middle of the night. Concerned, I got out of bed and tried to look out the bedroom window. I could only see a sliver of the front porch, and though I couldn't see an actual person, I could see the shadow of one thanks to the porch lights. Needless to say, I wasn't thrilled to have a stranger pay our isolated cabin a midnight visit. I told Elena to stay upstairs and made my way to the first floor, stopping by the living room to pull back the curtains ever so slightly and peer through the window. Still, given the shape of the house and the placement of the windows, it was impossible to see anything but a shadow. The person must have been standing an inch away from the front door. I scanned the front yard and the distant tree line, but didn't see anyone else, so a decoy, ambush situation seemed unlikely, but I still grabbed my handgun just in case. Just my luck. The old front door of the house didn't have a peephole, so I got up close to the door and tried talking to the person on the other end. "Can I help you?" I said. Instead of answering, the person knocked again, this time more urgently. No way in hell was I opening that door now. "Look, friend, if you need help, you better speak up. Otherwise, I'm going to have to ask you to get off my damn porch before I call the police." The knocking stopped, and after a moment, there was a woman's voice on the other side of the door. Her tone was nervous and her voice was soft. She said a single sentence. He's watching your daughter through the bear." Of all the things I expected to hear from our unwelcome visitor, that was not one of them. I readied my gun and cracked the door open. When I looked out into the night, I saw the elderly woman from earlier quickly shambling away from my door. Her back was turned towards me, and she looked like she was trying to get away from my porch as quickly as she could. I called after her, asking her what she was talking about, but she didn't look back. She just kept going until the night swallowed her up completely. I was pretty disturbed at this point, so I shut and locked the door and made my way back upstairs. Elena was waiting for me at the top of the stairs, and I quietly explained to her what was going on. Horrified, she went into Sophia's room and gently took the teddy bear out of our sleeping daughter's arms. We went downstairs and laid the bear out on the kitchen counter. I grabbed a pair of kitchen shears and dissected the thing, making an incision in its fluffy body and pulling out its cotton innards. It wasn't that I believed the old woman, just that, as a parent, anything related to my kids' safety, even something that sounds outlandish, is something I take seriously. Even though the woman was likely suffering from some kind of cognitive impairment, I still wanted to investigate. I pulled all of the stuffing out of Mr. Bear and found nothing, though Elena pointed out that the bear had two very large glass eyes, which could potentially be concealing a small camera. I was unable to find a hammer, but I did find a wrench under the kitchen sink. I wrapped the eyes in a kitchen towel and smashed them to bits. But when I sorted through the fragments, I didn't see anything that looked like a recording device. I was relieved, but I was also equal parts creeped out and angry. Maybe, like Elena had mentioned earlier, she was annoyed with the constant visitors to her neighboring cabin and was trying to scare us off. She might also have had some mental health issues or hallucinations. In either case, though, how did she know about the teddy bear? Maybe she had visited the house before, or maybe it was just a lucky guess. Before returning to bed, I took a turn around both floors of the cabin, looking and failing to find anything out of the ordinary. Elena was also pretty freaked out, and she got up several times in the night to visit Sophia's room down the hall and make sure all was well. Needless to say, neither of us got much sleep that night. Sunday morning was all doom and gloom, which ended up being a perfect reflection of my daughter's attitude when she woke up and realized Mr. Bear was gone. Obviously, we didn't tell her what had happened, but Elena and I did our best to distract her with flapjacks and promises of a fun day of adventuring. Unfortunately, the hike we had planned was foiled by a downpour that, of course, the forecast hadn't predicted, and so we decided to salvage the day by exploring the small town nearby. It wouldn't be the escape into nature we'd hoped for, but there were several family-owned restaurants and shops in the area, as well as a small library. The morning was all right. I enjoyed exploring the little town with my family, although there wasn't much to do. We had an early lunch at around 11 or so, but when we sat down, my wife started rifling through her backpack with a look of dismay. When I asked her what was wrong, she said that she didn't see Sophia's EpiPen, which we always like to have at the ready when we eat out. I realized immediately that I'd forgotten to put it back in Elena's backpack yesterday when I was reorganizing our stuff. I felt like such an idiot, and Elena, already grouchy from a sleepless night, really chewed me out for it. To make amends, I told her to wait with Sophia at the restaurant while I hurried back to the cabin for the EpiPen. She was displeased, but it felt like a better option than all of us braving the rain to return to the cabin. The drive back was an absolute nightmare. Sure, it was a short commute, but the dirt roads leading up to the cabin had turned to sludge in the heavy rain. I was in a foul mood when I entered the cabin. I shut the front door with a slam and made my way to the stairs. The house was dark thanks to the storm outside, dark enough that I almost missed the muddy shoe prints leading up the hardwood steps. When I saw them and realized what they were, I stopped in my tracks. I didn't have to wonder what they meant. Someone had been in the cabin since my family left, and judging by the fact that there was only one set of prints, they likely were still in the house with me at that very moment. I stood on the half landing, looking up at the second half of the staircase. The upper floor was eerily dark, so much so that someone could have been standing right at the edge of the staircase, and I wouldn't have been able to see them. I carefully walked backwards down the stairs, keeping my eyes peeled in case any shape suddenly emerged from the darkness. And once I made it down the stairs, I turned around and ran outside. I sat in my car and called the police to report a break-in. After calling Elena to explain the situation, I sat in my car and watched the house until the police arrived, which took almost an unreasonable amount of time. I never saw any movement from inside the house, nor did I see anyone leave, though I didn't have a great visual on the back door. It's possible that the intruder could have slipped through the back and run straight for the woods, in which case the cabin would have obscured them. The police were shockingly curt and dismissive about the whole thing. One of the officers who arrived on scene asked me for proof of a break-in, as if I would have had time to snap a picture of the intruder in my house or something. They did a sweep of the cabin and found no one inside, but even so, I didn't want my wife and daughter to set foot in that building again. I texted Elena, telling her I was going to pack up our stuff and that we should leave a night early, and she agreed. The cops stayed with me as I packed to give me some peace of mind, which I appreciated. Aside from the shoe prints, there weren't any obvious signs of a break-in, and strangely, nothing of value had been stolen, even though I'd left my laptop laying out in plain sight. Thankfully, we'd packed light, so it didn't take me long to grab all of our stuff from the master bedroom and the bathrooms. My last stop was Sophia's room, where I was quickly able to locate and pack all of her things. Nothing of Sophia's had been stolen or tampered with, but there was something missing from the fireplace mantle. Right in the center, there was a circular impression in the fine layer of dust, indicating that a certain figurine had recently been separated from its wooden brethren. Someone had taken the bear. Thanks for tuning in to today's horror story. If you have a horror, mystery, or haunting story you'd like to share, send it to us at Urban America Horror, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new episode when we upload it. We'll always be here waiting for your next horror story.